is the cutting edge. After 2 million years of blade making out of all sorts of materials and in all sorts of ways, for purposes as mundane as spreading butter and as ghastly as lopping off heads, the basics have never really changed. This sharp edge is the whole point.
The edge is the technology, and everything else is something that's wrapped around the edge to do a specific job.
A good cutting edge that remains strong over time is really quite treasured. And so there's a certain emotional attachment that will often come about between a person and the knives that they use.
Improbable as it sounds, some of today's sharpest knives, like this one, are made out of ceramic. Just like the pots for your mother's geraniums, only a lot more high-tech.
The fine ceramics, which is what we use to make our ceramic knives, that is a purified dirt, if you will. And it's processed, it's chemically altered to obtain a certain level of hardness and structural strength.
Japan's Kyocera makes knives not of metal, but of highly purified zirconium oxide and aluminum oxide, carefully mixed, molded, and fired. These ceramics give the blade great durability because the firing, or sintering process, creates new, stronger chemical bonds between molecules.
Ceramic is a much harder material than metal. And the best way to compare would be to diamond. We claim that our ceramic knives are almost as hard as diamond.
At prices between $75 and $300, Kyocera's knives don't come cheap. Not surprising when you consider the exacting quality control measures the company imposes on its blade-making process, which is both proprietary and secret.
It's like baking cookies or baking a cake. If you add too much salt, if you add too much sugar, you will alter the whole cake, the whole mix. So that is a very big challenge for production, because if a couple of particles are not right, then you have to just throw everything out and then start over again.
The end result is an extremely sharp knife that won't dull as quickly as metal knives. And ceramic knives won't corrode like metal ones will. There are drawbacks. You can't cut bones with them or frozen foods, because the brittle blades will chip. And if you hit them hard with a hammer, they'll probably break. Kyocera has launched blade making into the future with a variation on an apparently simple Stone Age technology like ceramics, underscoring the elegant simplicity of the cutting tool. The Stone Age. We define that period as the time when man began using stone to make tools like knives. And clearly, knives were something we needed.
Basically, it's the one thing that we have no natural part of our body that can serve that purpose, that is to slice things up, to cut things.
Archaeologists prize piles of flint or obsidian chips in their search for early communities.
Having a pile of flakes, the debris, shows where people were making implements. We start focusing more and more nowadays on looking at how implements were made, not just at the final tool that you have produced, but by analyzing the flakes themselves, you get insights into the sequence of events that took place to actually manufacture the tool.
With so little surviving from the Paleolithic period, the early Stone Age from 750,000 to 15,000 years ago, the distribution of artifacts tells how a site was used by its inhabitants. Further, the chips themselves have a lot to tell.
The difference between a chipped piece of flint and a knife is virtually nothing. Basically, knives in the old Stone Age were made from chips of flint. You would pick up a chip of flint that came off. It was already by itself razor sharp. So one of the issues that we face is really what kinds of pieces we find were used as tools, or were they just byproducts of manufacture.
One way scientists better understand Stone Age tool making is to recreate it by chipping. or knapping their own tools. In this case, very sharp blades are made from obsidian, a naturally occurring glass made from volcanic rock.
During the very earliest stone tool period, things were fairly simple. It would just be take a rock and knock off a flake which had a sharp edge to it. But just because it's simple doesn't mean it's not effective. In fact, experiments have shown you can just take one flake like that and butcher an entire antelope, for example.
Later Stone Age artifacts offer a clue to an even more significant technological breakthrough.
When you start to get the standardization of the human toolkit, that may be some kind of evidence that people are not simply watching what one another are doing, but actually perhaps beginning to talk about it.
Stone Age man clearly used these blades for hunting and dressing animals. They were also used for cutting wood and hacking vegetation. What is not so clear is when blade implements were first used in combat. Toward the end of the last ice age, over 11,000 years ago, evidence of flint and obsidian mining operations surfaces. But there were better materials, metals like iron and copper, that were much more malleable and much stronger than stone. Bronze, an alloy of 90% copper and 10% tin, proved to be such a breakthrough that its common use ushered in the Bronze Age, some 5,500 years ago.
Throughout human history, metallurgy has been one of the most sophisticated aspects of human technology. And in many ways, it's the production of arms and armor, and particularly of bladed weapons, that has been at the forefront of metals technology.
The origins of metalwork are lost in the labyrinth of history and myth. But it appears that iron extraction or smelting occurred in disparate locations at roughly the same time. Cutting implements could be heated, cast, and worked into a great variety of shapes. First, the copper and tin, which melts at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, would be melted over a fire or forge oven. Initially, these forges were often built on the side of a hill, where a steady draft supplied oxygen that increased the intensity and therefore the heat of the fire. Eventually, metalsmiths adopted the bellows, which uses an accordion-like bladder to provide an artificial airflow directly into the fire, increasing the heat. Ceramic or stone containers resistant to heat were used to hold the liquefying metals. Molten bronze could then be poured into a preformed mold or hammered into a predetermined shape. The biggest challenge for early artisans was supplying sufficient wood to sustain the fast-burning fire. Metalwork enabled artisans to forge larger, longer, stronger blades than anything they had been able to create out of stone. Metals like bronze were a revelation, and the Bronze Age ushered in the era of the most celebrated of all blade implements, and the only one that has no purpose beyond combat. Next, the sword. The elegant and powerful sword is the pinnacle of all blade implements, the culmination of blade-making technology. Though its construction is more complex, its role is far simpler than the axe or knife, each only part-time weapons. The sword is a killer through and through.
Swords are actually relatively late comers within the panoply of weapons. The earliest swords are from about 4,000 years ago.
Like axes and knives, early swords were made out of copper and later bronze. For millennia, they were very rare and highly prized.
Many of those earliest swords are said to have been swords reserved pretty much for chieftains.
Iron was also used to make swords, but iron was not a desirable metal.
Now, iron in its pure state does not hold a very good edge. It's a relatively soft metal. But if you add carbon to the mix, you harden the iron and you make steel. And that has proved over human history to be the ideal material for making edged weapons.
Steel is an alloy of iron and carbon. just as bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. While it is true that only in the mid-19th century was steel successfully mass-produced, creating the era of the skyscraper, man has been forging steel for as long as he has been working iron. Charcoal fires used in smelting and forging iron provide a source of carbon.
The technology that's used to produce iron from iron ore really involves carbon in the process.
A sword is really a very long knife. It's hard to pinpoint exactly where a long knife becomes a sword.
There's really no very hard and fast rule distinguishing between knives, daggers, and swords. To some degree, it's something of a matter of personal judgment. Does a weapon feel like something that you might be using just in the close quarters of dagger combat, or is it something that you might use at a greater distance in a more sword-like technique?
One way to distinguish swords is that they are far more complicated to produce than axes and knives. Any blacksmith can make either, but only a swordsmith can make a sword.
There's a lot of things that can go wrong in the manufacture of a blade. In fact, there's more things that can go wrong than can really go right.
Modern-day swordsmith Paul Champagne makes his swords using ancient techniques.
The basic tools of a swordsmith are, like most smiths, the hammer and anvil, a pair of tongs to hold the hot metal while you're hammering it on the anvil, and file. The other important thing is fire, the smith's forge. Without it, you can't make the steel, you can't form things to shape, and you can't get the steel hard or tempered back.
Paul harvests his iron from the Adirondacks near his home in upstate New York.
I end up starting with iron ore in the form of magnetite, which is just a black sand like you might find on a beach. Combine that with charcoal from hardwood, and you'll end up getting a chunk like this. It weighs about 60 pounds.
Paul uses up to 400 pounds of charcoal to create the hunk of metal.
It doesn't really look like a sword, so you have to break that up into smaller pieces to get some steel to work with. Part of this is some cast iron, part is iron, and part is some usable steel. Break that up again into smaller workable pieces. We'll flatten them out against the anvil and stack them up. It'll get heated up in the forge, pounded together, it's called forge welding, into a rough billet. Now you can still see all the cracks and impurities, some unevenness in the billet. I'll flatten that out again and get some stuff that's a bit pure.
The repeated pounding, heating, and folding of the metal separates out the impurities from the steel and eliminates air pockets, creating a stronger steel billet.
Stack them up again. Gets heated up hot in the fire. Forge welded again. As you can see, they're starting to stick together and all the voids are starting to fill up. What that gives you is a larger billet. And that'll be cut in the center, folded over, kind of like a pastry. And this will get drawn out. I'll use a power hammer made back in the late 20s. And forge this out, say 3 feet long or so. Pull a handle off of it, and we end up with what basically looks like a bar of steel. To put the edges on, draw the edge bevels, start with a larger shaping hammer. And then finish with a finishing hammer, so you can see how this is actually pulling off of the edges here down to an edge. You do that along the whole length, and you'll end up with something that looks like this. This is going to be a Viking pattern sword, so it'll have a fuller, which is this recess down the center of the blade. Now you're ready to clean this up a bit and heat treat it.
The blade is brought to a separate furnace for hardening.
First part of that is actually authenizing. Then we'll quench it, cool it down really quickly. So what's now soft steel turns into very hard steel.
Quenching or quick cooling the steel makes it especially hard because of a molecular change that occurs when the sword is heated to its critical temperature. At that point, the carbon atoms enter into the crystalline iron molecules, which have expanded due to the heating. By quick cooling the steel right at this point, the iron crystals contract, trapping the carbon atoms inside. The result is a very strong hardened steel. Further low heating, called tempering, will reduce the brittleness of hardened steel. The final stage in sword making involves the handle, or hilt, which often consists of a cross-like guard to prevent the hand from sliding up the blade, the handle for gripping the sword, and a pommel, which keeps the handle from slipping off the end of the sword and acts as a counterbalance.
Now everything again is usually done hot and then polished afterwards. For example, this pommel is hot set in the centers just to give a rough recess. You can put a square hole through the steel by drilling a hole and then using a hot punch, shaped like the end of the sword. Swords have to fit tight. It means everything has to go on and lock into place so it can't come off. It'll be fastened on there, but it has to be strong so it won't rattle, won't come apart. After everything is stacked and put together, cleaned up, the end of this would be peened over, so nothing's coming off of this. And the handle might be wrapped in cord and then leather, shaped to be comfortable for the hands, depending upon the time period and the culture that it was within. So after you've polished the blade, fit up the hilt, make sure everything's tight and peened it over, wrap the handle. After everything's sharpened, you end up with a finished blade, like this.
The finished sword is more than just a weapon. It is a work of art.
Swordsmiths were considered important. I mean, they had the technology, usually closely guarded secrets of how to make some of the most devastating weapons of the day.
As important as swordsmiths were, they were only half the story. The other half was the soldier, a trained swordsman who knew how to use the weapon in battle. Not in dandified demonstrations of technique, but in ruthless close-quarters combat, in which only one warrior was likely to survive. Next, hand-to-hand combat with swords. Swords, more than any other combat weapon, have attained a certain mystical aura, partly as a result of the difficulty in making them.
It's probably one of the reasons why named swords like Excalibur have entered into our mythology. A really good sword was a treasure that would be passed on from generation to generation. At the same time, the sword has a practical dimension to it that one doesn't see in a lot of other weapons. So the sword takes on a kind of symbolism as a means of defense and protection.
Swords felled unfortunate soldiers as far back as the Mycenaean period during the Trojan War, described by Homer. The later Romans were also well acquainted with swords.
The classic blade weapon of the Roman legionary was called the gladius hispaniensis, the Spanish sword, and is indeed believed to have originated from Spain. It's fairly short, mostly a stabbing weapon.
Roman swordsmiths would have provided soldiers with hundreds of thousands of these Spanish swords. Other cultures besides the Greeks and Romans also incorporated the sword into their militias, although the shape of the sword often reflected different methods of combat.
In the Middle East, typically swords tended to be curved, and one also gets typically curved swords in Japan, for example.
Later swords from the Middle Ages were designed to probe the weaknesses in plate armor. They were longer and emphasized the thrust over the cut. Sword fighting required specialized skills tailored to the shape of the sword to be used.
A slender tapering sword, rigid, would be used to fight heavy armor. A wide curved blade would be ideal for cutting at soft cloth armor.
John Clements and his associate Jeff Basham study ancient combat texts in order to recreate classic sword fighting techniques as part of their organization, the Association of Renaissance Martial Arts, or ARMA.
In between, you have a range of different weapons, from very, very slender tapering blades that are ideal for single combat in an urban environment, to different types of cutting and thrusting blades that were suitable for horseback or foot for facing a variety of armor, from chain ring armor or mail to different types of heavy leather armor.
Swords designed to thrust, particularly into armor, have more weight at the hilt or grip, which allows for greater point control.
It can't cut very well because it doesn't have the width or the mass or the edge bevel to deliver a powerful cut. So there's a trade-off with each type of sword design, and no one sword can do everything perfectly well.
Swords designed to cut have more weight toward the point or in the blade.
A wide blade is going to give a much more powerful cut than a narrow blade. If the blade is thick, however, it's not going to be able to cut very well because it would have to push too much material aside when it actually penetrates, when it bites into a target.
Unlike the formalized sport of fencing, real sword fighting isn't about scoring points and keeping form.
It doesn't matter whether you cleave an opponent's body in half or you pierce it through completely. You're still going to kill the opponent, and that's the purpose of swords. Swords were designed to kill people, and they did their job very well.
The characteristic hand-and-a-half sword, for example, of the late Middle Ages, was used in a technique that did not just simply slash with the edge of the sword, but also thrusted with the point, thrusted with the pommel, delivered attacks with the quillins. Indeed, every surface of the sword might be used aggressively, not to mention grappling and wrestling techniques. You never knew from which part of the sword the next attack was going to come.
This is not the swashbuckling style we're used to seeing in Hollywood costume dramas, but it's effective in real combat, and it's dead accurate. Despite their mythic stature, swords were probably never the principal weapon in battle.
That work has been done by weapons that can act at a greater distance. Probably the greatest burden has been on the spear, because the spear can be at the end of a shaft that is many feet long. The sword as a weapon is something that's used up close, and therefore I think would be that weapon of last resort, used for final dispatch.
Interestingly, an invention gathering momentum during the later Middle Ages would eventually relegate the sword to a largely ceremonial function.
Something better came along. That something was firearms, and the sword fell by the wayside.
Even as swords sank slowly but inevitably into oblivion, there was the odd cross-pollination. The bayonet was a bladed extension to the gun.
The technique of use of the bayonet and its function on the battlefield is more like the function of a spear. By this time, pikes essentially have been used and developed as a means of holding off cavalry, and the bayonet allows the musketeer to become his own pikeman.
American soldiers used short bayonets during World War II, so that the once majestic sword had essentially devolved back into a knife. With the dominance of the repeating firearm, the sword was almost totally relegated to a ceremonial position.
It became a piece of tacky costume jewelry. You know, these are certainly past the importance of a sword as a weapon.
Today, there is a small but devoted group of sword collectors who will pay high prices for authentic antique swords. There is an even smaller group of craftsmen, swordsmiths like Paul Champagne, who actually make blades to the demanding specifications that ancient swordsmiths followed. Swords that would be formidable in an ancient battle. These swords range in price anywhere from $2,000 to $20,000. The vast majority of manufactured ceremonial swords have no combat value whatsoever. Their purpose is to hang decoratively on a wall or off a hip. Today, the most familiar sword is probably the United States Marine officer's sword, manufactured by Wilkinson Sword of England, which also produces a number of British military swords, not to mention razor blades. It is not designed for combat. Like swords, axes have also fallen out of favor as combat weapons. But unlike the sword, the axe has proven to be a highly useful all-purpose blade. Next, the brutal power of the axe. Klondike days in Eagle River, Wisconsin. Temperature, 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Forecast, flurries. Today's attractions include dog sledding, chainsaw carving, a horse pull, and pony rides. But the biggest crowds are gathering for the lumberjack competition. Scheduled events include two-man bucking, underhand chop, pole climbing, and the springboard. And always a crowd pleaser is the axe throw.
While you're 20 feet from the target, target is 5 feet high from the bullseye, and you just got to get the right rotation on the axe where the axe sticks.
The axe is anywhere between 2 and 3 pounds. It's I use an axe that's specially made in New Zealand. Some of the competitors use that particular brand. All the axes we use are all double-bitted axes, especially made for axe throwing in competitions.
These events will draw close to 12,000 spectators over 2 days, with prize money totaling $7,500. Many competitors use specially made axes that would be impractical for timber cutting. For one thing, they are double-edged, good for throwing, but dangerous for chopping. For another, they're too small, and at around 3 pounds, too light to be much use for a serious lumberjack.
This axe is made in Sweden, and they're about $95 in this country, and that's all I use it for. I don't use it for anything else.
You don't really need to have any muscles to axe throw. Axe throwing's a lot like shooting a free throw. You know, some people can shoot free throws well, some people can't, you know, and it's the same basic thing.
Yeah, except that if you miss a free throw, nobody's in danger of having a gaping basketball wound in his or her head. Today's axe throwing competitions feature an exceptionally frivolous exercise for an utterly practical tool. And axes are simple tools designed to chop without much finesse. Unlike a knife, which can carefully slice or fillet, an axe is like a sharp club. It requires a big, forceful swing in order to launch its heavy head.
The first axes were made of stone, and these axes were used by the farmers to clear the land. As they would chip and be broken down, they would become smaller. And so this example has been reground several times and has ended up quite short.
With the advent of metallurgy during the Bronze Age, much stronger axes could be forged in kilns. The axe was not only a notably useful tool, it was also a formidable weapon. What it lacked in subtlety, it made up for in raw power.
The characteristic feature of an axe is that the weight is entirely concentrated in the head. Now this means the axe delivers a tremendously powerful blow. The disadvantage of an axe, of course, is that because the weight is all in the head, it's much slower. What this means in short terms is that the axe is used chiefly in a pretty aggressive style.
Some Bronze Age combat axes tried to mitigate the weapon's slow delivery with a double edge, so that a return swing could be just as deadly as an initial swing.
The axe actually has some substantial advantages over the sword. It's technologically easier to produce. It means the axe is cheap. And so the axe is an excellent weapon to use if you are just an ordinary foot soldier who doesn't have an awful lot of money at his disposal.
An axe is capable of delivering a more powerful blow than a sword. This became strategically important in the latter Middle Ages after plate armor was introduced.
Basically, an ordinary sword is not going to be able to chop through plate armor. You've got to find some kind of an alternative.
The battle axe came off the field of combat to become a weapon of justice, as the logical tool for beheadings. Though beheadings were familiar to cultures all over the world, they are particularly associated with England, thanks in part to Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. These big execution axes were often curved in order to make contact at a point, and thus more easily penetrate the flesh and bone. Axe manufacture was similar, though far less complicated than sword manufacture, and began with a forged brick, or billet, of metal.
You start with a billet, which is common to swords, knives, and axes. You have to start making the hole for the handle to go through. So you heat it up, again, yellow hot, a simple tool, simple punch, and drive it through to make a hole. Now that hole ends up being long and narrow, obviously too narrow for a handle. Then use a couple simple tools, very simple, to open it up, again driven through by hand, and then take another tool through the center to give it some of the roundness. Then all you have to do is take this part on the hammer or with strikers and draw it out and shape it to an edge. Flatten out the rest of it, and you have a primitive axe.
Even as axe production entered the Industrial Revolution, the simple methods used to make an axe changed little. Hand craftsmanship continued, as this early 20th century film taken at a Fiskars brand manufacturing plant in Finland shows. These days, things have changed. Unlike traditional hickory wood handles, those of fiberglass are hard to break and won't shrink or swell in changing temperatures and humidity. The center of gravity is located in the axe head, creating a more ergonomic axe. Fiskars tests each of its axes for strength and durability. Fiskars even makes axe accessories, like sharpeners for its many specialized axes. These Fiskars axes will be shipped all over the world and used to fell trees, not opponents. As versatile a tool as the axe is, modern warriors need something subtler, more sophisticated. Something lethal enough to fillet an opponent, yet delicate enough to spread butter. Next, the evolution and specialization of the knife. Weapons like the machine gun may have killed the sword, but they didn't entirely eliminate blades for the soldier. What remained was the stealthy knife. One of the great advantages the knife has over the sword is that it can be concealed.
Knives come in a variety of sizes and shapes, lengths. Some are single-edged, some are double-edged. Daggers are primarily used for killing, and daggers have two edges, narrowed to a point.
Once, nearly everyone, men and women, carried knives. Exquisite examples survive dating back through the late Stone Age. Much like swords, the shape of the knife determines how it will be used in combat. And this hinges on whether the knife is a cutter or a thruster.
These slashing knives tend to be single-edged, whereas the thrusting knives tend to be more double-edged.
Ron Harris is an edged weapons expert who, with Paul Barrick, demonstrates some basic knife fighting techniques.
The problem with the lethality is a debatable issue. When you slash someone, it might take them 3 to 5 minutes to bleed out. When you thrust someone, you disrupt the vital functions, the organs, and so on. They might stop instantly. They'll bleed inside. The problem with slashing is that you might be in a fight for a long time. 3 to 5 minutes might mean that you both end up in death grips.
Knives were too valuable as a multi-purpose tool to go the way of the sword. Firearms merely removed them from the realm of principal combat weapon. In fact, the utility knife is still a vital component of any soldier's battle gear. Not to mention weekend warriors of all stripes. Nowhere is that made more apparent than in the phenomenally successful Swiss Army knives.
I have two knives always in my pocket. One of them is the Midnight Manager. It has a small letter opener. It has a small, very practical ballpoint pen and an LED light. The next knife I always carry in my pocket is the Voyager, because this has a larger blade for harder work, and it also tells me the time and wakes me up in the morning.
Charles Elsner ought to have a couple of Swiss Army knives with him. He's president of Victorinox, the company that makes Swiss Army knives. In fact, his great-grandfather Karl Elsner founded the company over 100 years ago in Ibach, Switzerland.
In 1890, the Swiss Army had decided to buy soldier knives for all the soldiers of the Swiss Army. And in the beginning, there was a company in Solingen, Germany, who started to supply these knives.
Elsner thought those knives ought to be supplied by Swiss bladesmiths. So he came up with a plan to wrest the knife commission from the Germans.
Charles Elsner himself, he was a little bit too small for the order, and therefore he decided to found the Swiss Knife Association with the goal to supply the Swiss Army with the soldier knives.
Within a year, all the other association members had quit, and Elsner nearly went bankrupt. Although he was unable to produce the volume of knives the Germans could, his knives were better made and contained extras that endeared them to the soldiers.
In 1897, he developed a newer and a lighter model for officers. He called it sports and officers' knives. Only because of these knives and the success of these knives, he really overcame the competition from Germany.
The key to success was the innovative features Elsner kept adding to his knives. Even after Elsner's death in 1916, the family kept making knives and kept adding features. In 1923, the company introduced stainless steel knives, which didn't require constant polishing. But the company's greatest success would come out of World War II, when American soldiers stationed in Europe bought the handy knives in their PXs. The rest is history.
Today we have about 100 different models of Swiss Army knives. The most basic one is the standard model with 12 different functions. The most complex one is the Swiss gem. It has 33 different functions and features.
Although Victorinox is still family-owned, it is now the largest cutlery manufacturer in Europe, producing over 120,000 knives every day, or more than 25 million a year. 950 people work in Ibach, where the knives are made, and another 200 employees throughout the world work in distribution.
People always ask us, how can you always come up with some new ideas? But I think for our company it's very important to watch carefully the developments in the world, and these developments always give us some new ideas.
Victorinox also has a successful dining flatware line. Flatware is the term used for all those utensils from soup spoons to salad forks, steak knives to butter knives. In a sense, the butter knife is the latest refinement of the ancient flint-knapped blade. Today's flatware rarely inflicts serious injury, except for the occasional bagel fiasco.
For a lot of human history, the knife was something that you really carried by your side all the time. You're using it for cutting string, for eating at table, and sometimes for personal defense. So it's a kind of all-purpose implement that really becomes a part of your day-to-day life.
In early days, knives were valuable, yet simple. The dagger you used to dispatch your spouse's lover also worked beautifully to spear potatoes out of the communal dinner pot. But those uncomplicated times were not to last.
The first fork was introduced actually in Italy in about 1100 AD. And after that time, between 15 and 1600 AD, the fork and the knife were being used in conjunction with each other. So that was really when people first started to carve their own food and serve themselves.
Throwing a medieval dinner party for 12 meant welcoming 12 armed guests into your home. There was the very real danger that gatherings could turn into bloodbaths. In 1669, King Louis XIV of France ordered that all table knives have their points rounded off. From that point on, all table knives, shall we say, lost their edge. As flatware was refined, it became less menacing. Guests didn't need to unsheath their own knives. They'd find harmless ones waiting for them at table. Another innovation courtesy of the French king. He kept the sharp knives in the kitchen.
There are many different types of knives that are manufactured today and many years ago. There are knives out for paring, for example, or for deboning meat, or filleting fish, or what we call a cook's knife today, which is used in chopping vegetables. There are fine edge knives, which are what we manufacture as a fine edge, versus a serrated knife, which is almost like a saw-like knife. A saw-like knife could be used in cutting a hard-skinned vegetable, for example, something that you'd really need a sawing action for.
During the 19th century in America, flatware manufacturers flourished throughout western Massachusetts and upstate New York, where beautifully handcrafted utensils were made. Companies like Oneida carry on the tradition with mass-produced stainless steel flatware, which is cut and pressed out of sheets of metal during the assembly process. Oneida manufactures well over 10 million steak knives every year. Cutlery is big business. Cutco Cutlery of New York reported sales of more than 150 million in the year 2000. And who can forget the memorable and profitable 70s Uber infomercial for Ginsu knives?
It'll cut through a branch and still remain razor sharp. The more you use it, the better it cuts. How's that for sharp?
But the real innovation behind the Ginsu knife was its direct marketing plan.
But hold on, you even get 12 world-famous Ginsu steak knives, absolutely free. Not even a tin can can dull a Ginsu.
Since 1976, millions of Ginsu knives have been sold, with no sign of letting up anytime soon. Although it may seem like a fair distance from the kitschy Ginsu to the noble sword, the history of blade implements has always been the story of basic technology. Whether it is a high-tech ceramic or low-tech obsidian, it all comes down to that cutting edge.
The ability to produce knives and swords has been a force for innovation over the whole course of human history.
The idea of an edge, of making two planes of material meet so closely that they can actually cut through things, whether they're knives or axes or swords. The way I think of them is that the edge is the true technology.
Deep in the